Cool.
All you.
Hey, folks. So thanks for joining. That's actually really amazing for me to be here. This is RSA Conference 17, the first time that let me speak. Hopefully not the last time. I'll let you guys be the judge of that. We'll see. I'm from Rubrik. I'm Martin Walter. I'm the dude who has to build stuff at Rubrik. I run product management for everything security. I'm super excited to be here today. It's a little bit of a weird presentation for me because we're not going to be talking about product. And I'm joined today by Steve Stone, my partner in crime, not just in this presentation, but a lot of stuff that we do here.
Thanks, Martin. So as Martin said, I'm Steve Stone, also from Rubrik. I run Zero Labs. So effectively, my job is to look at threats and tell people bad news. So Martin has to clean up a lot of the messes I make. And as Martin mentioned, we work together quite a bit. So what I'd like to kind of jump into before we get into the slides is, we kind of came up with this idea for this presentation, like kind of over a beer, to be totally honest. So Martin and I both came to Rubrik the exact same day. One of the things that happened at Rubrik, and we don't want to make this about Rubrik at all, but just kind of a scene setting, we're both from traditional cybersecurity backgrounds. And we were brought into Rubrik to work data security. And we're sitting there one night talking about all the things that we've learned the hard way. And these light bulb moments we have on things that cybersecurity does wrong and things that data security does wrong. And we kind of made a joke about, like, wouldn't that be a cool presentation? And here we are. So that's what we're going to really talk about. We're going to talk about our perspective as two kind of dudes from cybersecurity that now have to figure out data security and what that really means to us. So kind of diving into it, we got to do this disclaimer. Hopefully there's no lawyers in the room, but here we check that box. So what I would say is this. This is what functionally Martin and I do. Our actual jobs, without diving into anything, we don't make this a corporate pitch, is our job is to understand how to make data defensible and the realities of that. My job is to look at what are the threats to data, what are the risks resident in data, and what are the right and effective ways to reduce risk. Martin's job is to actually make that real, to actually make technology that does that. I have the much easier part of that. But this is what we do all day long. Our job is to jack around this concept of, is your data defensible? And I think what Martin and I have found so interesting is, we both spent a couple decades, Martin primarily on the product side, building security products. My background's primarily on the services side, doing event response and threat intel. And neither of us had ever answered this question in our entire careers until we ended up here. And this is the only question that we now answer. So that's what we want to do today. We want to talk to you about our lessons learned on both cybersecurity and data security, and why we think those are not the same thing at all. So I'll kind of start the light bulb moments, passing it off to Martin.
Thank you. I think it might have been more than one beer. But anyways, so the first thing I want to cover was a huge learning for me when I joined the company. When I first got the call, it was like, backup, not sure about that. But what I learned is also that the recovery portion is what's really difficult. Like, everybody can take a backup, recovery is hard. And specifically when we talk about recovery from cyber attacks, we don't talk about recovery from, like, a hard drive failed, or like you lost the data center because it got stomped out by Godzilla or whatever it is. Right? It's really like the recovery from cyber attacks that gets really difficult and really messy. And this is not a technology problem, right? So let me just walk you through a little bit of a scenario here. Just assume for a moment you're a CISO, a CIO, somebody who has to report or is responsible for what's going on in the business from a digital perspective. So it's Monday morning, right? You drink your first coffee, you get a call, and somebody says, somebody from the team says, hey, one of our business critical applications is out, or maybe two even. You're like, yeah, that doesn't sound good. We'll see what that's about, right? So just try to get it back up and running, take a look, and so forth. You leave the house, second call. The same team calls, and it's like, hey, that application, we just found out that we can't just simply reboot the server and everything's back up and running because the data is not useful anymore. You're like, what do you mean not useful? It's garbled, it's deleted, whatever the case might be. And that's when you first realize, hey, is this the day where I'm dealing with a cyber attack? I've read about it in the news. Is this the day? And you're like, hey, let's get a hold of the right people. Let's get the application owners involved, the DBAs, whatever. That's a database admin, by the way. I learned that too, DBA. Get the DBAs involved. And your team is like, we don't know how, because I don't know if you still run Exchange, but the Exchange server is gone, right? We don't know how to get a hold of people. You're like, oh, this is really bad. So you're heading into the office. You arrive. Security team shows up. They're like, hey, we're dealing with a massive system compromise. We had adversary access in the environment for potentially weeks. So they also went after the backup. They deleted a lot of our backup, which is something we see all the time. And also the adversary access was likely backed up. So if we just recover, we're going to start the cycle over again. And that's when you realize, oh, we're going to deal with some extended downtime here. This is bad. At which point, you have to update the CEO, the CFO, general counsel, whatever the case might be. And you're like, hey, look, we don't know how long we're going to be down for. And the CEO is like, what did I tell the board? We are losing like $1 million every day. When are we going to be back up and running? This is turning into a cash flow problem, potentially. And then, general counsel says, hey, do we also know if there was any customer data impacted? Because if it's regulated data, you might have to report that within 48 hours or 72 hours, depending on the regulation. And that's when it hits you, right? That's when it really hits you. Mondays suck. Not good. Not a good start to the week. All right. But the important bit here really is, this is why this is messy, because it's like such a big thing, such a big event. It's much more than what people usually have on the radar. And one of the things that I learned is data is irreplaceable. Now let that sink in for a moment. Once the last copy of your data is gone or outside of your control, what are you going to do? Hardware, you can replace. Data centers, you can replace. You can even replace people. But once your data is gone, it's gone. And because everything relies on data in our lives today and our businesses, that is really a big deal, right? You have to think about your data. So, but the silver lining is, there is a way to be at least a little bit better prepared than like the example we just walked through. And there's a few things I learned that you have to have as an organization to be better prepared for the day off. Number one, you got to have an immutable backup. If you don't know what an immutable backup is, that's okay. I didn't know either. Google it. Very, very important, because it's essentially a backup that protects your data from adversary access and helps you make sure that you have a lifeline. So you got to have that lifeline. The second thing, understand your business critical applications. Absolute key. Understand what drives the business and the dependencies. You won't believe how often I talk to customers who are like, we knew how to bring Oracle back, but we didn't know that we need DNS for our clients to be able to connect to it. So understand the dependencies that support these applications, make these applications work. Understand who you need to come back from these cyber attacks, who plays a role in the recovery process. And it's not just security and IT, it's also your communications team. It's your IR team that might be an external company you keep on retainer. Understand who you need and make sure that these people understand their roles and responsibilities in the process. And then fourth, and I cannot stress this enough, have primary and secondary means of communication. And it could be because the Exchange server is dead. I hope nobody uses Lotus Notes anymore, but you get the point, right? If that communication is gone, it might also be that you're facing a compromise of your communication. It might be you're using Slack and your adversary is in the environment and is actually listening into those conversations. Have secondary means of conversations. Go old school, phone, set up a bridge. Have a printed out list of the people you need for the day off and ways to get a hold of them. And then the last thing, have a recovery plan. A plan that helps you really be prepared for how you bring those business critical applications back up online while your whole environment is down, while your incident response team goes to town and tries to figure out what hit you. And this is actually critical because you have to have a plan that you also test. And I would recommend test on a quarterly basis because the environment changes, and every time the environment changes, you need to consider the new plan. Now, you could say, everybody has a strategy, or what was it? No strategy survives contact with the enemy, or what I prefer is everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. Different interpretation of the same thing. But I tell you one thing, even an imperfect plan that you can execute on is better than no plan for the day off. So that's one of the things that I learned, and with it really, the data is used by everybody in your organization. Everybody relies on data, everybody needs data. So the security of it, also in the recovery case, is everybody's problem. It's not just IT, it's not just security, it's comms, it's everybody involved. So you have to make sure that it's understood that the security of your data and the recovery process is an all hands on deck effort. So that was light bulb moment number one.
Thanks, Martin. So most of my career has been in threat intelligence. Did it in the intelligence community, did it at several organizations in the private sector, and was brought to our current organization to do just that. Stand up our first ever threat intelligence team there at Rubrik. And what was interesting was the very first lesson I learned, the very first really painful experience, honestly, was I had no peer group anymore. I had really grown up in the intelligence community, and there was always other organizations. The tradecraft was similar, the skill sets were similar, and you knew where to go. When I was at Mandiant and we were running into a problem, we could talk to other intelligence teams. We could talk to our peers and competitors. We could talk to the US government. We could talk to lots of entities. And so all of a sudden I ended up at Rubrik. I said, I need some help here. I need to talk to somebody about the things I'm looking at. And I found out really quickly, there is no intelligence applied to data security. And that sounds very absolutist. And I would love to hear the opposite. If anyone knows an Intel team working data security, please let me know, because I would love to talk with them. But it just doesn't exist. It was a very jarring motion to kind of drop into this data security community and effectively, for the first time in my career, have no peer group and nowhere I could go and compare our results and our findings with another organization. So I kind of went back to my old peer group. I went back to the folks that I was used to working with and said, here's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at threats to data. I'm trying to understand data baselines. I'm really trying to establish context for these events. And what I found out the painful way was something I probably should have already known was we didn't look at it in those communities either. It just wasn't done. And so the same event was being studied from different angles, and there was this massive gulf when it came to applying intelligence tradecraft to data specifically. And I'll kind of give one example here. Everything you're gonna see there, these 3 headlines, these are all real headlines. We just removed the actual victim name from the headline. Other than that, these are word for word stories in the last 30 days. And so here's the problem. And these are effectively the same kind of things that in my career we were used to passing to decision makers. We would go and say, hey, senior leader, CEO, general, senator, you had a problem and you lost 100 gigs or you have 1 million users impacted. And I would offer anybody to stress test this. I bet you could open your newsfeed this morning and you'll probably see a headline very similar to these. Here's the problem. What does that do? That has no context. That has no meaning. There's nothing a decision maker can do around that. That is inherently unhelpful. And so as we try to struggle with this was where we really started from with data security and intelligence. And the first thing we really try to do, and this makes a lot of intelligence professionals a little nervous, when you just strip it down, what all it is, whether it's business intelligence, strategic intelligence, cyber intelligence, terrorism intelligence, all you're doing is looking at a problem, you're picking out the right context, and you're trying to convert that context to a decision maker so they can make a decision. That's all it is. It sounds really simple, but it actually is. It's just that simple. Problem is, there's no context in these headlines. There's no decision to be made off of this. And again, these are news headlines, but this is not any different at all from the intelligence reports that I was used to writing and conveying to decision makers. So that's kind of the bad news. The good news of this, though, is data in particular is actually really well suited to threat intelligence. And I'll just give kind of one example. One of the things that we do is we measure data. And that sounds silly, but one of the questions I ask almost every CISO, and a few folks have already heard me say this, if I go to a CISO and say, how many endpoints are you securing? She can usually tell me that. If I go to a CISO and say, how many employees are you protecting? She can usually tell me that. If I ask that same individual, how much data are you securing? The room gets real quiet real fast. And I would say that's not just the CISOs, that's the SOCs, that's the IR team, that's the threat intelligence teams. So we actually started measuring data and setting baselines. A typical organization has X amount of data, Y amount of sensitive data, pretty straightforward stuff. And then we began measuring like ransomware as an example. We can effectively evaluate the blast radius. We can say, for a ransomware attack, this much data was encrypted, here's where it is, here's the type of data it is, and now we can start really providing context. And I'll give one example here. We can say that a healthcare organization, when we look at all of them at scale using telemetry, the ransomware blast radius for healthcare is about 23% larger. That is not interesting at all. That has no inherent meaning. What we can say, though, is inside of that blast radius, that typical ransomware event against healthcare impacts 4 times more sensitive data. The exact same bad actor using the exact same tools, doing the exact same things, when it's pointed at healthcare, there will be almost 400% more sensitive data impacted. Now we've got some context. Now we can start converting that because we can say effectively, we can go to C-suites and boards and say, it's not because you're being attacked uniquely, you're not. Ransomware actors in particular really don't go after industries differently, but they produce different impacts. And we were able to dive into this and say, why is this number so much higher? We could find the anomaly. It's not that healthcare is inherently unique from a defense perspective. It's not that they're inherently bigger. They're a little bit bigger. But we can say, well, this is pretty straightforward. Sensitive data inside of healthcare is growing at 5 times the global average. And that sensitive data tends to be in lots of places in a healthcare organization. So now we can proactively go to decision makers, and I'll use that healthcare example and say, if you want to reduce your risk for ransomware intrusions, two most impactful things you can do: control your sensitive data growth and control where it is. Does that solve your problem? No, it does not. But that's a real decision we can put in front of that decision maker instead of saying, man, I sure hope we don't have a ransomware attack. That's going to be really nasty. And so we can really provide this context. And one of the things that we've found over the last couple of years is understanding data immediately contributes to threat intelligence, and vice versa. Threat intelligence as a tradecraft applied to data security is an absolute game changer. It changes every discussion immediately in our vast 2 years experience of doing this. So this was the first light bulb moment for me, and arguably the biggest one based on my background. The other one I would say is I spent a lot of my career doing event response, whether that's managed defense, MDR solutions, supporting incident response, and we focused a lot on what defenders can see. And that visibility, and you can't defend what you can't see, that visibility is almost uniquely around infrastructure. And again, I don't want to provide this as a statement of fact. I would love to actually provide it as a stress test. I would challenge anyone to walk into any SOC and say, what are you looking at? What is your defensive boundary? And I will bet Martin's paycheck, it's probably going to be email gateways, firewalls, endpoints. There's likely a SOC, and I'm going to say likely because I have yet to see it. And again, if folks have it, I would absolutely love to hear it. I have yet to walk into a SOC and say, here's the data we're securing. That's just not how it's done. That's not the defensive boundary organizations are looking at. They're not looking at data. Here's the problem with this. We actually tried to understand this problem a little bit. So we went out and engaged 1,600 security and IT leaders. Half of them were CIOs, CISOs. The other half were direct reports to them. So we're talking VP Cloud Ops, Senior Director SecOps, CIO, CISO, that kind of audience. As we asked them their biggest challenges when it came to securing data, what you see on the left was the one that was identified the most. 2 out of 3 of them, 2 out of 3 of 1,600 security and IT leaders said, we believe our data growth is outpacing our ability to secure it, and more importantly, manage our institutional risk. There's one really important word I want to point out. They said believe, because they don't actually know. They don't have visibility into their data, and so this becomes like a feels question. So we kind of asked that follow-on question. How many of these same senior leaders felt they had adequate data visibility? And you can see that number on the right. Almost all of them said, yeah, we have significant challenges here. The other important piece here is we actually tried to ask where these gaps were. Can you not see it in cloud? Can you not see it in SaaS? Is it the virtualized environments that are giving you problems? And that believe word came up again. They believe they have data visibility challenges, but they don't actually know. So one of the very first things we did in Zero Labs that we took on as a challenge was, can we get data visibility? Is it actually a thing that can be done, or is that why no one's doing it because it's impossible? And it turns out it's like super possible. It's very solvable. And so what I want to kind of present here is we started looking at a defensive boundary from a data perspective. The very first thing that popped up is how fast that boundary is moving forward. And this is actually where we think a lot of the intrusions occur. So I don't want to walk through all the numbers. We measure things in backend terabytes. We could get into a super nerd session on what backend versus front end is. 2 things I would point out is, as we started looking at data and how it's growing, the very first thing that popped up is data is growing at about 42% every 18 months. That 18 months period was the most stable growth we could measure. And so as we looked at that and we extrapolated that forward, that means within 5 years, a typical data estate is going to grow 7x. Compare that to endpoints. Imagine if I went to a CIO and said, you're going to have 7 times the number of endpoints in the next 5 years. That's going to be a major project. There's going to be PMs involved. There's going to be lots of teams involved. The CFO is definitely going to be involved. But this is happening every single day on the data front. The other piece, and I'll stress test the context piece again, here's what this means from a typical organization. A typical organization's data growing at that rate, a standard organization today, in 5 years, will look like the top 1% of organizations we secure. So effectively, what we're saying is, if you think you're an average organization, you should be preparing to secure the data equivalent of a Fortune 50 company. When we think about things in this term, data visibility becomes critically important. It's living, it's breathing, it's growing, it's moving. And then again, we drill down and we look at sensitive data. This is the part that matters. This is the regulated data. This is the material loss we talk about with SEC. And we measure sensitive data alone. I just checked this coming here this morning. Typical organization has about 28 million sensitive data records. That's about the average, all industries, all regions. Wild variation by industries. I would love to have that talk one day if anyone's interested. But again, this growth rate is actually higher than 7x for sensitive data. A typical organization with 28 million sensitive data records today, and again, I go back to the news feeds, you don't have to go very far back in your news feed to read about a data breach. That organization is on track to have 175 million sensitive data records inside of their organization in 5 years. Let's put that in perspective again. If we take the financial industry, that is the highest ratio of sensitive data we see in any industry, and we take our 3 largest organizations, that combined is right about that 175 million sensitive data records. So what we're effectively saying to CIOs and CISOs is, however much sensitive data you think you have today, you are likely going to have to secure your data and the equivalent of 3.5 of the largest financial institutions within 5 years. And I think when we start talking about things in these terms, now we start understanding where some of these seams are and where some of this attacker surface area comes from. And I think the biggest takeaway for me, the light bulb moment studying these kinds of things and the defensive realities is, this is the real boundary. Understanding the defensive boundary for an organization, infrastructure is important. In no way am I saying it's not. That's not where the rubber is meeting the road. Your defensive boundary is actually your data. And the more we look at it, and we actually see real solvable problems once we start tackling the defensive boundary as data versus endpoints, email gateways, firewalls, the things that we're very comfortable doing inside of cybersecurity. So with that, I'll kind of pass it over to Martin for his next lesson learned.
Thank you. So when I first started, or like before I started, I thought, something is wrong, right, in our industry. Because at the end of the day, as Steve already said, we worked at different big name security companies that at the end of the day try to protect data, right? So whether it's a firewall, endpoint, whatever, we all focused on protecting the data. We're trying to protect the data. On the other hand, though, we never get access to the data, so we can't learn anything about it. So how do you protect something that you don't understand, that they don't have any visibility into, to Steve's point? So when I first got the call, I thought this is what backup's like. And I would argue a lot of us here in the room think the same thing right now, right? I thought, just write a bunch of stuff to tape and put on a shelf, and fingers crossed you never need to take it off the shelf again, right? So that's what I thought. But backup has actually changed a lot, simply because of what Steve pointed out, the growth in data. You can't just write this stuff on the tapes anymore and then hope you can recover in a timely fashion. It doesn't work that way anymore. Backup has changed a ton. In fact, what we are talking about today is vast clusters of servers with mostly storage, right? To store all your data, or store that backup. But there's also a ton of compute, a ton of memory in there, right? So you can't actually put that to work, because if you think about it, and this is something like an analyst I've been talking to a while ago said, like, hey, look, your backup is your data in a different state. Now think about that. If it's still your data, and you got a ton of compute, you got a ton of memory, you can put that to work to give you insights to make everything else in your environment better. And this is actually super cool. Now, when you think about your backup today and what it can do to you, or do for you, or how it can help you, that's probably what your facial expression is going to be. You're like, I don't know what my backup would do for me. But your backup knows where it got the data from. It sometimes even knows what's in the data. And also, you can't recover anything if you can't recover the right permissions. So it also knows who has access to the data. And you can spin that thought experiment a little bit further and really go through a list of what can your backup tell you today. And this is not a comprehensive list, but let's just start with where your data is stored. Going back to Steve's point, the defensive boundary. Where is it located? Wouldn't it be good to know, like if your GDPR data ends up in the United States, would be a good thing to know, right? What type of data you have, structured, unstructured, what workloads you're dealing with, what's in the data. Most backup solutions today, and it's probably like not well advertised, analyze your data. They can tell you, like a backup solution can tell you, where's your HIPAA relevant data? Where's your PCI relevant data? Where did they get that from? Who has access to the data? How your data is changing, because it's like a flight recorder over time, right? And who's changing and who's accessing your data? I mean, that would be amazing to have this information at your fingertips. In a SOC, for example, when you chase down security incidents. So for me, like, and this is hands down the reason why I'm here at Rubrik, as like, somebody who's worked in the security space for the last 27 years, is because I believe we need to look at our backup differently from a security perspective. Yes, it is a means to recover. But because of what it knows about your data, it is almost like your SIM for data. It knows how your data has changed, how it's moved around, who moved it, who accessed it, who wrote it, what's in your data. And the best part about it, you can hook this up. There's APIs. Have you heard of APIs, by the way? I'm just, anyway, joking. But you can hook this up to your other tools to make your other tools more, better. Make them more data aware. Really come up with a data-centric security view. You can hook this up to an XDR. You can hook this data up to your firewall. So you can write policy that says, these users can only access this type of data. You can make everything better because it has that visibility. So light bulb moment really is, we need to think about backup differently from a security perspective. It's not those damn tapes you put on the shelf and never take off. It has incredible insights we need to protect that very same thing. That was my biggest light bulb moment.
So anyone that's worked with me, I always do 3 things, and no more, no less. My third thing that I learned in my vast 2 years of experience as a data security expert is about ransomware. And anyone that's been in the threat intelligence business, our job is to make assessments. We don't report facts. Our job is to say what we think is going to happen, and that means you can be wrong sometimes. Probably, and I've been doing this long enough to have been wrong a lot. I have a lot of papers I have written and was universally absolutely wrong. One of the ones I was most wrong on, in 2016, the CEO of the company I was working for came to me and said, Steve, there's kind of this ransomware thing. Like, is this going to be a big deal? And I wrote this assessment. I did a bunch of research, and I said, nope, this is not going to be a big deal. This is just the new DDoS. This is going to go away real quick. Don't worry about it. We're chasing nations. We're doing these high-end cyber criminals, stealing all kinds of stuff. And here I am in 2024, and basically all I research is ransomware. So one of the things that has really hit me in all of my experiences, and we see it over and over again in data security in particular, is ransomware is teaching the same lessons again and again and again. I don't see variation. When we look at this from a threat perspective, the ransomware actors are changing fairly slowly. They're changing over time, but it's pretty predictable. And the impacts on organizations are almost universal. And this is a real challenge. It's a real challenge to see victims find out the hard way the same thing the other victims have learned. So as we kind of thought about this and said, this is probably one of the most important things that we can convert from a threat perspective is, what are these lessons? Let's just surface these lessons so hopefully organizations can work on this from a data perspective and be better prepared for these moments. And here's going to be the pretty straightforward lessons. The biggest one, everybody learns backups really matter. And it's a fair assessment to say, well, Steve Martin, you work at a backup company, you're incredibly biased. That's fair. Yeah, that's true. But one of my tasks is to go out and be objective, is to go out and say, what are other entities saying, and then combine that with our data. So what you see in blue, this came from a European university, and what you see in orange came from engaging, again, that 1,600 senior leaders that were not Rubrik clients. So everything you're going to see on the screen I'm going to talk about is not from our viewpoint. So this European university, they studied 2 things. They spent about 3 years studying what makes organizations pay a ransom, and then second, what influences the size of a ransom payment. So as we looked at that, and it very much maps to our experiences, the single most impactful thing in ransomware is having recoverable backups. If an organization demonstrates that they can have a recoverable backup, they are 27 times less likely to pay a ransom. So again, I go back to the earlier point around context for decision makers. Let's make this not ransomware. Imagine you could go into your boss and say, I have this one thing, and it's going to reduce our cloud cost by 27x. Or you go to your security team and say, I can give you a 27x improvement on alert triage. We would be all over that. And here's hard data from a non-backup company. This is from an actual academic study. The second thing they found was when it comes to ransom payments, there's really only one lever that matters, and it's if you have compromised data. If the attackers can steal data along with whether they encrypt or not encrypt the data, you're 5 times more likely to pay a higher ransom. Your ransom is going to be 5.5 times larger than if data is not stolen. So this is pretty straightforward. If you have a recoverable backup and you can limit or stop data theft, you're almost exclusively not going to pay a ransom. If you do not have recoverable backups, you are almost absolutely going to pay a ransom. That's just in the data. And then what we heard from these senior leaders, the attackers know backups matter too. This is one of the few pivots we've seen from ransomware actors over time. They are actively going after backups. And we talked to these non-Rubrik organizations. We asked them these questions that straight out, these numbers are from 2023. We said, of all the cyber attacks that you dealt with, how many times did attackers go after backups? And I want to be careful here with wording. Not ransomware intrusions, any intrusion. 96% of the time, attackers tried to influence backups. They tried to steal it, they tried to delete it, they tried to alter it. And they were successful to some degree 74% of the time. And this goes back to Martin's earlier point. It's one thing to have a backup. That's a nice check in the box. That doesn't mean you can recover data. Those are fundamentally different things. And we see that very clearly talking with these senior leaders. And as we dive down into what happens with ransomware, we kind of focused on 3 different questions that we thought were really important. First, what is the biggest issue organizations identified after a ransomware attack? What was the biggest problem they had? That's what you'll see on the left. Second one, what was the single biggest impact that they had after a ransomware attack? That's the middle. And then the one on the right, what was the single most consistent change? What was the thing that changed the most at organizations? And we got the same answers again and again and again. First one, biggest issue, working across a hybrid environment. And Martin's mentioned a couple of times, but one of the things that we deal with a lot, every organization's hybrid. Organizations will say, well, we're on-prem or we're cloud. That's just not true. I have yet, and I love using absolutes on stage because it's pretty dangerous. It creates good follow-on conversations afterwards. I would challenge any organization to say, are you only on-prem or are you only cloud? I have never seen an organization, and I come out of the intelligence community. I come out of classified networks. What actually is true is not just that they're all 3, they're on-prem, cloud, and SaaS. They're multi-on-prem. They have multiple on-premises locations. Almost every organization in the cloud has multiple clouds, and almost all of them are actually using multiple cloud vendors, meaning Azure, GCP, AWS, and they're using multiple SaaS applications. And again, I'll use Rubrik as an example. We are multi all 3 of those things. We are like all caps hybrid for our data estate. So we know that's the biggest challenge. Trying to defend across a hybrid environment is the absolute largest challenge for ransomware. Second one, that impact, this one really surprised me. One of the few things that surprised me, I thought this would be about business loss, I thought this would be about technology, and these senior leaders just said again and again and again, the biggest impact, the thing that they wrestled with a very long tail, was nobody had confidence anymore. There was this crisis of confidence. Senior leaders didn't trust their teams because they just learned the hard way. They weren't as prepared as they thought they were. Individual teams were second-guessing their own performance, and in many cases, as we're now seeing more and more breaches go public, entire companies didn't trust their own companies. So this is a real problem that has to be solved. And the last one, and I think this probably won't surprise anybody based on that crisis of confidence, the single largest change was not technology, it was not business change, it was increased senior leader scrutiny. And I think this is actually a good thing. This sounds like a problem, but having done intrusion response and defending networks, I actually love senior leaders getting involved. Things tend to happen very quickly when senior leaders get involved. We might not always like it. It gets very uncomfortable when all of a sudden the C-suite and the board are asking questions they've never asked, and usually organizations are not prepared to answer those questions, which then goes right back to the crisis of confidence. We're not able to answer this increased level of scrutiny, and it just tightens this circle tighter and tighter and tighter. And again, we see this over and over and over again. So here's the good news of that. We know exactly what needs to be solved for. These are the 3 things, no matter what your data estate is, your level of proficiency, what industry you're in, these are the 3 things you will almost universally have to solve for on the other side of a ransomware attack. The great news is now we know what those are, so we can solve them before a ransomware attack and really help make ourselves more resilient. First one, we've said this a bunch of times, and we're not done saying it yet. I'll kind of bury the lead. You've got to be ready for a contested recovery. Organizations expect, I've got a backup, I've got a DR plan, and I'm going to hit the switches, and it's going to work. Well, Martin already mentioned how hard that is already. And oh, by the way, the bad guys get a vote, and they are going to make that as difficult as possible. So if you prepare for that contested recovery, you're going to be so much better off. Second, you've got to focus on hybrid data estates. And again, we see a lot of mix here. We see organizations that are very prepared to defend on premises, and they're not having visibility in the cloud. They don't protect SaaS. And again, I'll kind of go back to that SOC example. If you ask an organization, what's one of your most critical systems? How do you generate revenue? How do you pay bills? Well, it's Salesforce. How many of you have ever been a SOC where the SOC's managing Salesforce? Like actively looking at Salesforce and Salesforce data. I've seen it exactly 0 times. Like it just doesn't happen. So understanding that hybrid data estate and defending that becomes really, really important. And third, we kind of call it double visibility. If you can increase your data visibility, which we've already talked about, you're going to understand your defensive boundary. Oh, by the way, the more visibility you have, the quicker you can address senior leader scrutiny. You can provide better answers, you can show improvements and trends, and this is also how you can address that crisis and confidence. How do you reinstill to your own teams, you're better off the next time? It can't be trust us. The more visibility you have, the better you can provide these answers. And I think that was the big light bulb moment for me is, these are actually super cheap solutions. These are relatively, I don't want to get too cute here, these are relatively inexpensive. You don't have to go out and buy a silver bullet technology that you just saw on the floor down below. These are high return outcomes. They scale well. They're relatively inexpensive. Most organizations actually already have the tools to do this already. It's just applying them in different ways. And so this bad news became good news. We can actually solve the most consistent challenges relatively straightforward. And so with that, I'll leave it to Martin for the next piece of bad news.
Thank you, Steve. Unlike Steve, I do make bold statements and speak in absolutes. So I would argue, from a security perspective, the way how we defend our data today is all wrong. It's all busted. Makes no sense. And there's multiple reasons for that. I want to start with, I don't want to belabor ransomware anymore, right? We have talked about ransomware enough, but there's a couple of interesting data points in this history of ransomware that I want to point out, right? About 10 years ago, ransomware gangs introduced this whole concept of ransomware as a service. Now, what does this mean, right? We had a couple of ransomware groups that essentially was so successful, they needed more boots on the ground. We called it a channel business. They turned into a channel business. That is ridiculous in itself. Number two, we have seen ransomware actors going after big companies and really specializing in industries and the systems that are being used in these industries, the regulatory fines these organizations would face, et cetera, et cetera. So specialization in industries. Then we have seen double extortion. You know, from a software perspective or like a technology company perspective, what we would call it is multiple means to monetize your installer base. So they turn into multi-product companies, if you will. And then lastly, we have also seen a value chain evolving with initial access brokers, getting initial access to an organization, selling that access to the actual ransomware actor, so increasing specialization. Those 4 things are all hallmarks of very, very successful businesses and markets. So why is that an industry? Because it works, and it continues to work. I shamelessly stole this slide from Steve. Hope he forgives me. I'm going to buy him a beer later. But there's some interesting research that came out of Zero Labs along the lines of why do companies actually pay or consider to pay the ransom. In that research that you mentioned previously with these 1,600 security leaders, or you said IT leaders, I think as well, 72% of them said they would or have paid the ransom in case of a ransomware attack. Now the question is why? About 40% of those said, well, it's because our environment was encrypted, we needed to get it back up and running. So it became an economic decision. The ransom payment was lower than the potential cash flow issue. Another 40% said, well, we had a lot of regulated data that would have gotten exposed and the regulatory fine would have been more expensive than the ransom. So again, an economic decision. But that's why this continues to work. Now, why do we get into these situations? And I think that's where cybersecurity, I believe, is broken, fundamentally broken. There's a couple of interesting perspectives on how should we think about security that we've seen over the years, starting with the NIST cybersecurity framework. I love this framework. It's a great framework. It's a really good framework that helps us understand from a process perspective, how should we be securing our environments. Starts with identify your critical assets, protect them, detect any attempts against those assets, respond to those attempts, recover and learn. Great. But if you just walk the show floor, what you'll see is over the last 10 years, the industry has been heavily focused on respond and detect. And we really have completely neglected the other areas that are very, very important to make sure we don't get into the problem in the first place. So that's evidence number 1. Number 2, from a security strategy perspective, I'm old, you can see the gray hair, right? I still love the kill chain. it helps us understand, like break down different things, such as how does defense in depth work? How should it work? The idea behind defense in depth was break down a cyber attack into different phases and find means to disrupt every single phase of these attacks, right? Great. But when you look at like the last stage, impact or actions on objective, literally where the bad guys lay hands on the data, encrypt it, steal it, destroy it, whatever the case might be, there's virtually nothing in terms of capabilities you can use to prevent this last stage, disrupt this last stage. I read an article that suggested deception would work here. And I found that deceiving in itself, it makes no sense. So defense in depth really didn't go deep enough. Okay, evidence number 2. Now, number 3, and this is like, also my fault because I've been working in the space for so long, we have been heavily focused as a security industry to deliver different capabilities that are really focused on the infrastructure. And thank you, Gartner, for giving us all these acronyms. Anybody from Gartner in here? I hope I don't step on any toes. But we got all these wonderful acronyms of different tech with great promise that are focused on cloud infrastructure security, network security, endpoint security. But whatever happened to the data? We see these capabilities getting bypassed day in and day out. And after adversaries bypass infrastructure security means they virtually have free access to the data, the stuff that hurts us the most, the stuff we're trying to protect. So from an industry perspective, we also fell short. We didn't deliver a meaningful data security capability. Now that's all the bad news, because I do believe data security is busted and completely broken because we need to think about it from a data perspective. We need to start with the data, understanding our data, because we can't defend it if we don't understand it. Now, there's some good news. How do we actually secure the data? And there's something nuanced in this headline, right? How do we secure the data if attackers are logging in, and we like to say not necessarily break in anymore? Virtually any cyber attack today involves stolen credentials, compromised identities, stolen access tokens, API keys, whatever it might be, right? Either for the initial access or for lateral movement later. So how do you actually stop something if you don't have any IOCs you can act on, any file hashes, any IPS signatures and so forth? How do you deal with that? And I said earlier, this is my first time they let me talk at RSA conference, and hopefully it's not my last time because there's a little bit of a segue here, but bear with me. I know it's weird when Germans talk about U-boats, but we're going to talk about U-boats for a moment, or submarines. Submarines are really interesting because they provide a great capability in naval warfare. What is interesting is they're rather fragile things, and I didn't know that, right? They have a hull, and that hull protects the boat. And the funny thing about submarines is they get even more vulnerable the more they dive. And it's kind of weird because they're submarines, they're supposed to dive. But because you only have this hull to protect the boat, and when you have a breach in the hull, the boat floods with water and the boat is lost. But to prevent that scenario, engineers essentially came up with this notion of sections. They divide a submarine into sections, multiple sections. Every one of these sections serves a function that is not vital in itself to the rest of the boat. So that when there's a single compromise of that hull, the section is lost, but the rest of the boat essentially stays functional or operational for the largest part. So the boat has a chance to survive. Do you get why I'm going there? It's not some weird German stuff. But the idea is really, how do we make sure that a single identity compromise doesn't lead to a loss of our business by virtue of the data getting completely impacted? So there's a couple of things that I think we can do when we think about data security. First of all, we have to stop thinking about prevention. When we think about data security, it's about managing risk. And risk starts with understanding your risk. So you have to do some real good discovery to understand what data, and this is the key word here, what data you're responsible for. Because every asset of data that's in your environment, you're responsible for. And then you got to get rid of all the stuff that doesn't serve a business purpose. So that's the first step. The second step is understand what you still use in your business process. If you have regulated data assets around that are 3 or 4 or 5 years old, do you need them on live systems? If the answer is no, archive it, remove it from live systems because it still introduces risk. If it gets out, you face regulatory fines. Those make you pay the ransom, right? Third step, relatively straightforward, right? Make sure the data is stored securely, which includes an immutable backup. Make sure you got that lifeline. Make sure it's stored securely. Step number 4, make sure the right people have access to the data, not everybody. And this sounds like almost, oh God, now you're talking about zero trust for data. We will never reach the nirvana state. No, that's not what I'm talking about. Simple stuff. If you have, like, let's say, PII data for your employees and product management has access to it, there's no need. It should be HR and just that. Start there. It's simple. And then, of course, whatever access allowed, make sure you monitor that people still do what they're supposed to do with that data. There's no change in behavior that could be indicative of a user getting compromised, etc. It's all about managing risk to your data. So that was, for me, the big light bulb moment that access to data is the actual vulnerability. When Okta, we love Okta, and Ping Identity and all those guys talk about identity as the next perimeter, that is true. I buy that. But much like you patch servers, even though you got a firewall sitting in front of it, you patch those vulnerabilities, you need to think about access. Because if that identity gets compromised through some form of attack, your data is at risk. Now, for me as a takeaway, when we as a company talk about cyber resilience, we mean something actually relatively straightforward. I'm a big mountain biker, and it's a very painful learning curve, right? So I'm not saying you should crash, but the idea here is really, if you ensure that you have that lifeline, your backup that you come back from, and a plan to do so, and if you make sure that your data is not at risk in the first place, attacks will happen, they can happen. But it's just like a mountain biking. You might crash, you get up, you dust yourself off, get back in the saddle, and you keep moving, you stay in the race. And that is really the key about cyber resilience, what we talk about as a company.
Yeah, so we'd like to leave it with this. A big focus for us is we're not here to tell bad news. We're here to actually help reduce risk. It is really the critical thing for us. And what I would say is there's 3 things. There's 3 things we tell every single organization. It's not if you're one of our clients, if you're one of our competitors' clients, you don't have to buy our gear. Martin's boss would love if you will. But independent of all of that, if you can do these 3 things, you're going to solve almost all of these problems. And the first thing we always talk about, and we've mentioned it several times here, if you hear us anywhere else, you're going to hear us talking about this, it's data visibility. You have to understand your data. You have to know how much you have, where is it, what's regulated, and then you can really start making impactful decisions. Second piece here, and again, we talk about this again and again and again, you don't need a backup plan. You don't need a recovery plan. You need a contested recovery plan. You have to plan for the attackers getting a vote, and you have to plan for a bunch of things to break. Once you do that, the different solutions start emerging and you start solving problems before you're in a crisis. And I promise you, this is going to be hard. A contested recovery plan is incredibly difficult. It will be painful. But that imperfect plan tested is going to make you better. And we just openly advocate for a contested recovery plan. And the last one, and this one sounds really cheesy, it sounds really easy, but this is actually one of the biggest challenges we run into. As Martin said earlier, data belongs to everybody. There is no team at any company that owns data. Security does not own it, IT does not own it, business does not own it, and then conversely, they all own it. Bring those teams together today. It's likely to be an awkward meeting. It's going to be a big meeting. There's going to be a lot of people in the room. But once you start having those conversations, the good news is organizations find out very quickly they have far more resources to deal with threat and risk than they ever did before. As a former SOC stander, I loved this. It was always our problem. The weight was on our shoulders. And then all of a sudden, the lawyer's involved, HR's involved, GRC's involved, the CFO was involved. We talk about capacity problems. You know who solves capacity problems? The CFO solves those problems. So bring all these teams together because they're gonna have to work together anyway. If you actually deal with a ransomware attack or a data breach, those teams are gonna start working together one way or the other. So we just openly advocate for bringing them together today. Things will move faster, they will be cheaper, and the outcomes will be demonstrably higher. And we just really preach these 3 things again and again and again. And so with that, we just want to say we really appreciate everyone's time. I know it's towards the end of the day, towards the end of the conference, so we're glad to see as many people here as there are. And if there's any questions, we'll definitely stick around and answer those. I know we're about time, so I apologize we won't take any here live, but Martin and I will hang tight for a few minutes, and we really thank everyone for being here.
Thank you.